Today's breakdown video is brought to you by Grubhub. Whether you're watching the Rings of Power or other streaming favorites, Grubhub makes for a great way to tune in and take out, enjoying your favorite eats while you stream. And I personally just discovered that Amazon Prime members get Grubhub Plus for free, which means $0 delivery fees on eligible orders. Stay tuned after the breakdown to learn more. Alright folks, we are back at it for another breakdown covering the final episode of the Rings of Power Season 2. Now, I'm a firm believer that the best place to experience Middle-earth will always be the books. So give them a read, and make sure you're subscribed as we dive into Tolkien's lore each and every week here on Nerd of the Rings. The episode opens with Durin and Narvi making their way to where King Durin attacked his own people. Disa points out that the king has been taken mind and soul by the ring, and we'll get to the importance and a possible issue around this later on. Durin and Disa share a kiss, and folks, I'm sorry, but I'm gonna bring up the kiss that should not be named one last time to point out something. We see Narvi look away in discomfort, and honestly, if they would have used this same shot with Adar last episode, plus a close-up of the handoff and less grand music, the argument that it was purely for the exchange would have had a lot more validity. Anyway, Durin says whatever you hear don't come down that mine, meaning he's planning to give his dad the old Yeller treatment. Sorry, that's a super old reference, give it a Google if you don't know. We catch up with the king and he's using a battering ram to break down the stone, so this answers the earlier question about Narvi and his crew carrying this contraption. It is indeed a ram they use for mining. The camera pans down and we see veins of mithril throughout the caverns below, but then one lights up with a fiery glow as we hear the growl of the Balrog. Durin demands that Durin take off the ring, but Durin asks if he could really strike down his father, and Durin says no, and that Durin has always been stronger than him, and tells a story about arm wrestling Durin. The king resumes and breaks through the wall, opening up the cavern. The Durins take in the side of the mithril mines, and Durin IV has this nice line about his father teaching him that the mountain doesn't truly belong to them. Durin III says that it could, and that they need to use the rings. They're interrupted by the Balrog, who ropes the king around his ankle. Apparently this is his signature move. And if you're playing the movie reference drinking game, I think this counts. After Durin IV gets thrown back, we get something that I thought was really cool design-wise. We saw back in Season 1 that the Balrog's design is nearly identical to the one seen in the films, and this is also the case here. One area where it appears they may be different is in the wings. Now for those unfamiliar, this is a hotly debated topic in the Tolkien fandom, whether Balrogs have actual wings. Fans of the channel will know that I am on team no wings, though I fully admit they also look really cool with wings. Looking at the Balrog here, it seems like these wings are purely made out of smoke. Now, it's not always easy to see them in the films, but they are smoke combined with kind of a skeletal outline of a wing structure. Now, I think you might catch a brief glimpse of a skeleton, so it's possible the design is wholly the same. But at least on first watch, it seemed like there was more smoke to them. Anyway, there's my excuse to talk about Balrog wings for a moment. Check out my video on the topic if you want to hear my argument for no wings. The king looks for his son, and knowing the danger coming for them apparently snaps him out of his ring sickness, for lack of a better term. He reveals that he never let his son lift his hand when they arm wrestled. It was just him getting stronger. And he calls him King Durin, which is a nice final moment between father and son. We then get Durin III charging at the Balrog, sacrificing himself in a slow-mo shot that admittedly goes pretty hard. I figured we'd probably lose this character at some point ever since the Balrog was teased in Season 1, but it is a bit of a bummer to lose Peter Mullen as part of the cast because he really made an excellent dwarf. One final note on the Balrog, it's likely that this confrontation will earn the Balrog its name, Durin's Bane. It's worth noting that in the books, it receives this name after being unleashed and killing King Durin VI. Well over 3,500 years after the creation of the Rings of Power in 1980 of the Third Age. After the opening credits, we are back in Rhûn with the wizard futurely known as Gandalf, and yeah, we'll definitely be getting into that later on. He shows up to find a horse in Storville with the eye symbol we've previously seen. Again, this symbol certainly gives off Eye of Sauron vibes, a symbol we find on things like the armor of his orcs in the books. As the stranger looks around, the dark wizard approaches, saying Manwe promised he would come. In the books, it is Manwe, the king of the Valar, who summons a council to send a group of Maiar to Middle-earth to combat the rise of Sauron. This account, found in Unfinished Tales, results in the selection of the 5 Istari, or wizards, who arrive by ship around the year 1000 of the Third Age. Next, the Dark Wizard shares that it was the stranger who convinced him to come to Middle-earth, knowing that none of them could hope to defeat Sauron alone. Now, there's a couple things in this short bit here. The idea of one wizard being convinced to go does occur, though notably Gandalf is not the one doing the convincing. In fact, Gandalf himself has to be convinced to go, for he feared Sauron. Saruman is convinced to take Radagast along with him. And finally, and most notable here I think, is that Alatar, one of the blue wizards, originally volunteers, then brings along his friend Palando, the other blue wizard. Though it doesn't say if he had to be convinced or was simply a +1. As mentioned, Gandalf feared Sauron, so the idea that he would go only as a group has merit from a logic standpoint. The Dark Wizard promises to help Gandalf remember who he is and get answers, and then the hobbits are revealed to be captured by the runic nomads. Aberforth acts all shocked at them holding the hobbits captive and kills Goldenface when he says their people used to be kings. This perhaps implies that they once ruled the lands the Dark Wizard himself now seems to rule over. Aberforth pushes back against the Dark Wizard moniker, and his talk here made me wonder how long he's been kicking around Rune. The stranger's been around for maybe a few weeks? He also references all 5 wizards, so perhaps that means Saruman and Radagast are exploring around somewhere. Or maybe the Valar experimented with the whole meteor delivery system and decided they should stick to boats from now on. Now, I've seen a lot of folks theorizing that the Dark Wizard will end up being the Witch King. However, as he is definitely one of the 5 wizards, I don't see that happening, as he is not in fact a man. I did, however, think that maybe the leader of these helmet guys might have been revealed to be Khamu the Easterling, the second in command of the Ringwraiths, and the only one we know by name. However, this dude's dead now, so we can cross him off the Nazgul list. Now, a bit of a lore deep dive here. Tolkien did originally introduce the Witch King as the Wizard King, as he was taking an early crack at the Council of Elrond chapter, which is found in the History of Middle-earth book, The Treason of Isengard. Obviously, we know Tolkien would later change him from being a fallen wizard to him being one of the 9 men enslaved by their rings. The 2 wizards talk about Sauron, and it's revealed that Aberforth wants to defeat Sauron to be his successor, and tells Gandalf that together they could both be his successors. Now, this is probably a bit of a peripheral reference to the books, I think, as there we find Saruman speaking to Gandalf, first about joining Sauron, then about overthrowing him by claiming the One Ring for themselves. In that moment, Gandalf points out that only one hand at a time can wield the One Ring, and refuses the wayward ways of the White Wizard. Real quick, before this, we get a moment where the Dark Wizard ridicules Nori for having pity on those who had just had a knife to her throat. And I'm honestly a bit torn on this because while I love the sentiment, I think it's not nearly as impactful of a moment for me as it could have been. It's likely that this moment plays off another similar one in the books a wee bit, where we find Frodo showing pity towards Saruman multiple times, even after being stabbed by him. Frodo is okay because of his mithril shirt and refuses to let the hobbits kill Saruman despite the attempt. It is truly a great moment of pity, a theme that is absolutely integral to The Lord of the Rings. The integration here, though, I gotta say didn't hit me nearly as well because of how hard I find it to resonate with the hobbits of the show. But if this moment of chatting about it leads anyone watching this video to read the Scouring of the Shire to experience Frodo's pity themselves, it's well worth this little tangent I've gone on. Aberforth goes Rey Skywalker on some rocks and drops them all over Storville, saying it's a taste of the suffering all Middle-earth will know should Sauron be victorious. He tells Stranger that he'll be waiting for him when he comes to his senses. We then see Gandalf using his own powers to levitate the rocks before we see the clear sky. And in the sky, we see the constellation that the Stranger has been looking for since the very beginning of Season 1, hinting that this is where he was meant to be going the entire time. We then cut to Numenor with a shot of the white tree of Nimloth. At first I thought the leaves had changed color, but I think it's just the color of the sunrise or sunset coming through the opening behind it. Judging by the windows and the opening in the background, we are looking toward the chambers where the next scene takes place. As in previous episodes, we've seen the other side of the white tree is wide open, And again, I pointed this out in Season 1, but we see the ruined nature of the structure around the White Tree, which certainly indicates it's been some time since Numenorians truly cared about its significance. Now, in the following scene, we find that Pharazôn has summoned the leaders of the faithful. He apologizes for the late hour, which confirms what we saw in the previous shot was indeed sunset. Now, real quick, I think this might actually present a continuity error. As I mentioned, the previous shot shows sunset behind the White Tree, coming from the direction of this chamber. However, in episode 5, Pharazôn looks out this direction and talks of every sunset being a reminder of their mortality, as the sun sets on the opposite side. Back to the story, Pharazôn has summoned the leaders of the faithful, claiming that Miriel duped the sea monster because she had the help of Sauron. Proof of this is apparently on the paper that Pharazôn hands over, and I immediately wondered what kind of proof this could possibly be to justify the full-scale rounding up of faithful Numenorians that immediately transpires. I theorized last time we saw Numenor that perhaps Pharazôn learned Halbrand was Sauron when he looked into the Palantir. But it seems a huge leap to go from Pharazôn writing this down on a paper to them being able to declare all faithful traitors. Numenor is still pretty perplexing to me. As I said before, I can't tell how many faithful there are versus Kingsmen and what exactly the situation is in terms of how much power and influence each group wields. We get the sense the faithful are on their way out and less powerful, but are they just sheep for the slaughter at this point? It feels like we were dropped into the middle of the situation, kinda got a vague idea, and now everything is falling to pieces without much clarity on how the sides interact or relate. I've said before, I think the trio of Elendil, Miriel, and Pharazôn are strong actors for the roles they've been cast in. Now they just need more to work with. It feels like we got bits of that for each character this season, but we need much more from Numenor going forward in my opinion. Now Belzegar here drops the name Westerness. This is the common speech name for Numenor itself. In Tolkien's letters, he says this vaguely means Western lands in Middle English. The soldiers begin the mass roundup of the faithful, and Eärien has a bit of a change of heart and leaves to tell her father Elendil. We then get a shot of the petals of the White Tree falling en masse. You may recall from Season 1 that this is taken to be a sign of ill omen, representing the tears of the Valar when bad things are afoot. This happened when they started to send Galadriel away in Season 1, leading them to bring her back. In the background of the shot, we can see the statue of Eärendil, a prominent feature of the city as depicted in the show, which is of Elrond's father, and we can see Elwing, his mother, in her bird form from the famous story of the First Age. Eärien warns Elendil, who makes his escape. He goes to Miriel looking to get her out as well, but Miriel refuses, saying her place is here. I've got a theory on how this will play out based on the books, which we'll get to later in the breakdown. She then gives Elendil his famous sword, Narsil. We caught a glimpse of this sword in the Palantir room in Season 1 when Galadriel first enters. As with many great artifacts of Middle-earth, Narsil has a long history. It is said to have been forged in the deeps of time, likely during the First Age, by the dwarf smith Telkar, and would become an heirloom of the kings of Numenor, then the lords of Andúnië, which is likely the lordship Miriel is referring to Elendil taking up here. Elendil mentions his son Anarion being in the westlands of Numenor, which is where Andúnië lies. Here, Elendil translates Narsil as white flame, and Tolkien in his letters breaks down this Quenya word with Nar meaning fire and Thil meaning white light. No doubt Elendil's sword draw will remind fans of a similar moment in the Return of the King film, when Aragorn draws this very sword reforged, Andúril, the Flame of the West. And viewers of my channel will no doubt remember I've been quite critical of this show using callbacks to the films, but I have to be honest, I don't mind this one at all. For one, it's not a shot-for-shot remake, and for me the biggest key part is that Elendil and Aragorn are characters meant by Tolkien to echo one another. Aragorn is in so many ways an overcoming of the failure of Isildur and a return to the glory of Elendil. So for those who think I'm just totally against any callbacks or references, here's your proof that I'm not. I just wish for them to make sense. This connective tissue, as I call it, only makes sense if they are things worth connecting. When it comes to Elendil and Aragorn, they absolutely are. One thing I'm curious though to hear from viewers new to Lord of the Rings is, does this dramatic sword draw make any sense to you without the background info I just gave? Within the show, we've not been given any reason to have a strong feeling tied to this sword, and not a whole lot in regards to Elendil's lordship. I could see this being something that only truly feels weighty if you've seen the films or read the books. I will say I do like the reflected white light and sound effect as the sword passes Elendil's face. In the books, Narsil and Anduril have such poetic and epic descriptions of appearing like a flame, and that's gotta be something tricky to capture in film. So even a bit of white reflection can be a bit of a nod to that, and probably as much as is feasible. Back in Eregion, orcs are overflowing the city as we get a pretty long oneer here, ending with Galadriel and a group of elf maids escaping through the tunnels. I did have a question about the tunnels that I didn't get into in the last episode because my breakdown was getting crazy long. But Galadriel mentions these being old dwarven tunnels, and my mind immediately wondered why there would be old dwarven tunnels in Eregion. It's pretty clear in the earlier episodes that the dwarves and elves in the show do not have a history of getting along or working together. Celebrimbor hints at that earlier this season. The only thing I could think of is if they're saying dwarves had tunnels built in the lands of Eregion prior to the elves settling there. I'm not really sure on this one. Galadriel says she will give the orcs 9 good reasons to let the other elves go and take her to Adar, and the orcs apparently agree. Then we are back in the broken forge room where Celebrimbor is bloodied and pierced with arrows, with Sauron doing the archery practice. This is something inspired directly from the books. In Unfinished Tales, Sauron torments Celebrimbor, forcing him to disclose the locations of the 16 rings. However, he would not give up the locations of the 3, which he held above all others. Sauron has the smith put to death, and we read the chilling result as Sauron turns his eyes toward Elrond's forces. In black anger, he turned back to battle, and bearing as a banner Celebrimbor's body hung upon a pole, shot through with orc arrows, he turned upon the forces of Elrond. Back to the show, we see Sauron putting pressure on an arrow that appears to be between Celebrimbor's ribs, and he talks about the orcs in the heat of combat, saying when Gondolin fell, their blood hunger went on for weeks. Another fun book note here, in Tolkien's very first writings mentioning Celebrimbor, he actually lives in Gondolin before becoming one of the followers of Galadriel and Celeborn. We also know that Celebrimbor lived in Nargothrond, meaning that if we take all of Tolkien's accounts of this character, he experiences the downfall of 3 elven realms. What follows next is 2 moments from Celebrimbor that show the true potential I hoped to see from this show when it was first announced. First, as he lays pierced with arrows, Celebrimbor says, "But the rings are beyond your reach, as I shall be ere long. For soon I shall go to the shores of the morning, borne hence by a wind that you can never follow." This is simultaneously defiance and resignation. Celebrimbor knows he will die soon, and he knows what will happen to his soul, or as it is called in Tolkien's world, Fea. Twice in Tolkien's works we see characters that die whose spirits are cast away by a wind from the west, the opposite of what Celebrimbor describes will happen to him. The first is Sauron himself after the ring is destroyed, and the second is Saruman after he is killed by Grima in the Shire. And next we get what is hands down my favorite part this show has given us in its 2 seasons. Celebrimbor speaking with the foresight of death, calling Sauron the shadow of Morgoth, and saying in the end the rings of power will destroy him, with it taking but one to bring his utter ruin. Sauron then stabs Celebrimbor with his spear and lifts him up, saying that he is their creator and master. And Celebrimbor replies, "No, you are their prisoner." He then calls him Sauron, Lord of the Rings, and so passes Celebrimbor, grandson of Feanor. Sauron then leaves him pierced with the spear hanging in the air. Again, a reference to Celebrimbor being used as a banner in the books. Now, we'll get to see how the season ends in a bit, but I do wonder if they'll have a prosthetic Celebrimbor as a banner with the orcs to open season 3. Another bit here, Celebrimbor mentions foreseeing Sauron's ruin. We've talked before about elven foresight being a thing, but characters foretelling the future before their death is a recurring thing in Tolkien. And I'm just gonna read a couple because they're all pretty awesome. First is Feanor, and looking out from the slopes of the arid Wethrin with his last sight, he beheld far off the peaks of Thangorodrim, mightiest of the towers of Middle-earth, and knew with the foreknowledge of death that no power of the Noldor would ever overthrow them. But he cursed the name of Morgoth thrice, and laid it upon his sons to hold to their oath, and to avenge their father. In another story, Gwyndor would tell Turin with his dying breath that should he save Finduilas, she would save him from his ill fate. However, Turin would fail and his dark path would await him. Finally, a mortal man, Huor's last words to King Turgon during the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, would foretell the birth of Elrond's father, Earendil. This I say to you, Lord, with the eyes of death, though we part here forever, and I shall not look upon your white walls again. From you and from me, a new star will arise. Like I said, this scene is my favorite of the entire show. A final meeting between these two of torment is in the books, and we get some additional nods here, but the defiance of Celebrimbor and the proclamation he makes are both original to the show, yet feel Tolkienian in nature. It's moments like this, and I don't mean just moments that are dramatic or intense, just across the board, moments big and small that fill the gaps of Tolkien's text this well that we need much more of in this show. I think Charles Edwards and Charlie Vickers are definitely the MVPs of this season, as Durin and Elrond were in Season 1. And if I were to pick one acting performance that has a chance at awards nominations, I'm definitely going with Charles Edwards. The guy brought it in these last 2 episodes. Part of me does wonder if it might have worked even better if they had stuck with the book sequence of events and the One Ring was already forged. Imagine Celebrimbor's remarks that the rings will be his ruin, and Sauron knows he's already completed his entire plan. Whatever Celebrimbor sees, there's no turning back on the rings now. As it is, I'm guessing that Sauron would assume Celebrimbor saying it will only take one ring to bring him ruin means one of the 3 elven rings, perhaps encouraging him even more to create the one. Super random, but did anyone else think in this moment that Charlie Vickers could be like Henry Cavill Witcher's little brother? Just me? Okay, that's cool. Anyway, Glug and the Orc Patrol shows up, and after shedding a tear for Celebrimbor, or perhaps for the chance that he's made a grave mistake, he asks for the orc's name. Moving on, we come to Pelargir, where we see a single large Numenorian ship and then soldiers unloading boats at the dock, before we cut inside to catch up with Isildur. He and Theo bond over losing their mothers, and it's kinda nice. Theo even gives him a hug, which is kinda sweet for a kid in mourning finding a big brother figure. There's been lots of theories on who Theo might be, with a lot saying Witch King. But man, I'm really starting to think King of the Dead would hit really hard if we get more of their relationship in the coming couple of seasons. The Army of the Dead, also known as the Oathbreakers, are the army that Aragorn summons in the Return of the King, and they are cursed by Isildur himself for having betrayed him. Next, Estrid comes in, they chat for a bit, and finally get around to smoochy kissing. And they aren't passing anything between them but sweet, sweet saliva, so I guess we know it's romantic. Turns out Jerky McJerkface was sent by his father to manage Pelargir, and Theo tries to introduce himself, which he ignores. Estrid's boyfriend is like, "You probably didn't hear. His mom was Bronwyn." And I was kinda like, why would a random Numenorian show up care about Bronwyn? I mean, I don't so much, and I watched her on my TV screen all last season. Kemen and Isildur meet for the first time since the boat exploding incident in Season 1, and Kemen plays off being relieved to see him, and we get a shout out for Beric. Hooray, Isildur's horse lives! And you may think I'm being sarcastic, but I'm not. I personally want to see Beric kill more orcs, and I'm convinced he could give a better hype speech than Bronwyn. Sorry, no more Bronwyn bashing. RIP, of course. Anyway, things for some reason escalate quite quickly when Kemen finds out that Isildur has a girlfriend. He denies her passage on the boat and reveals his father being king and Elendil being wanted for treason. And yeah, I'm still dreaming of just terrible deaths for Jerkface Kemen. He's another that's been theorized for the Witch King, and I think the Black Captain and Lord of the Nazgul is way too cool of a character for this guy. Seriously, the dude has Mouth of Sauron written all over him. And yes, I know this doesn't happen in the books, but doesn't being a middle manager for centuries then getting decapitated by movie Aragorn feel like a fitting end for this guy? Or, you know, he could just die in this show, that would be cool too. Kemen reveals that Pelargir is no longer a Numenorian colony, which it doesn't appear it has been for a while given its condition and lack of Numenorians, and that it is now a fortress for its soldiers, demanding a tribute of lumber in exchange for the civilians remaining. He says they're only trees, clearly setting up a future conflict with the nearby Ents. So you know how Groot lifts the guy up by the nose in the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie? That would be pretty cool to see done to Kemen too. Next, we catch up with Adar, and Galadriel says she will finally team up with him. Adar reveals he has her ring, which has healed his body, so now he looks straight up elven. I thought it was kind of interesting they still shot this exchange at the Dutch angles used for their previous 2 big scenes together, as I was thinking in the moment that this might be a time where you might change to more traditional angles as their objectives finally align. Adar says they should team up to kill Sauron with the ring, and I'm still not sure how Morgoth's crown plus magic ring equals dead Sauron, but here shortly the math won't matter so much. He says they'll do that, then he'll take his orcs home and they'll never plague Middle-earth, and that they can heal the rift between elf and orc. And man, this is still weird to me, I gotta say. It's very much like Scar wanting lion and hyena to come together. Like, dude, that ain't gonna work, who are you kidding? Glug shows up injured, but is playing possum and stabs Adar in the side. Then the orcs go all Ides of March on Adar like they did to Sauron in episode 1. And sure enough, as we guessed back in the first episode when Sauron baited Adar into moving against Eregion, his goal was to take over the orcs and supplant Adar. Glug asks Sauron what orders he has for them, and Sauron orders them to raise Eregion and bring him their leaders. They repeat lines hailing Sauron as the new Dark Lord, and I forgot to mention this in the premiere episode, but a fun fact from the books is that Aragorn says Sauron does not allow his name to be spelt or spoken by his servants. A notable exception is apparently the mouth of Sauron and the messenger to Erebor, who is likely either the mouth himself or a Nazgul, both of whom use the term Sauron the Great. Sauron turns to Galadriel, who asks if it was all his design from the beginning. Sauron basically says he can't see all ends, but clearly we're led to believe that he's at least a good improviser and working steps ahead of his enemies. He says how he wishes to heal all Middle-earth, and Galadriel has a pretty good comeback for that, saying, "As you healed Eregion?" Speaking of Eregion, we go there next, where we see the elf leaders being led into the city, and Gil-galad turns around his ring Vilya to hide it from the orcs. They come to the courtyard just as the orcs tear down the statue of Celebrimbor. And I gotta say, I sympathize with Elrond here as he's like, please don't burn the books and maps and scrolls. Back with Galadriel, Sauron says surely she of all elves must understand to find the light they must first touch the darkness. And I kind of wanted her to be like, look, I love my brother, but that was some pretty nonsense advice, and I'm gonna try to kill you now. After a tumble, Sauron goes through a series of illusions, appearing as Halbrand, Galadriel herself, then Celebrimbor, giving her quotes from notable moments of each. Halbrand talking about holding on to the feeling of fighting at her side, from one of my personal least favorite moments of Season 1, then Galadriel talking about being indistinguishable from the evil she fights, then Celebrimbor saying, "Are they not the seeds you planted?" And this was the same quote Celebrimbor said in Galadriel's vision earlier in the season. After they both fall from elven Stonehenge, Sauron turns back on Galadriel saying he knows her mind and the door is still open. She replies the door is shut and spin kicks him into the wall. And like, this is pretty standard action movie type stuff, like, it's fine. Maybe I'm nitpicking, but I was thinking it might be a bit more unique to Tolkien if he was doing all these illusion things and she said the door is shut, shutting off her mind to his illusions, causing them to stop. It would have played into Tolkien's Osanwe, or interchange of thought, which we are told can only be done when the receiver's mind is open and that nothing can penetrate a mind that is closed. Galadriel finally gets a slice in, and real quick, we got some good glimpses earlier of Sauron's breastplate, which has serpents on it. In the Silmarillion, a serpent is one of the forms we see Sauron shapeshift into. We then see Sauron stab Galadriel with Morgoth's crown. Sauron says he would have brought all Middle-earth to its knees to worship the light of its queen, and man, I just gotta say, I hope this episode marks the end of this weird king and queen Sauron and Galadriel thing. It was hands down one of my least favorite things of Season 1, and any reminder of it is just kinda like salt in the wound at this point. Galadriel says the Free Peoples will always resist Sauron, and Sauron pulls the crown out, taking the 9 rings that fall out of her coat. Just then, the dwarves show up to save the few surviving elves from the orcs, with Narvi leading the way. Then Sauron talks to Galadriel in her mind. So if the show is using the book concept of Osanwe, this would apparently mean the door isn't actually shut. She says, "You wish to heal Middle-earth," pretending to hand over her ring before saying, "Heal yourself," which sounds pretty close to F you. She then casts herself off the ledge by falling backwards. Just my personal opinion, but it wasn't the strongest dialogue between these two in this scene. Definitely nothing near the level of Celebrimbor earlier in the episode. Glug shows up telling Sauron they are overwhelmed by the dwarves, and that if they pursue, many orcs will die, when Sauron stabs him through the chest. I get that we're probably supposed to be like, oh, the nice orc with a wife and kid died, but I was just like, yeah, Sauron being ruthless. Back on the ground, Arondir and Gil-galad find Galadriel in her injured state, and we see the wound from the crown, which definitely gives off some of those Morgul wound vibes we saw Frodo suffer in the Fellowship of the Ring. Then Gil-galad says they're not wounds of the body, but that her very immortal spirit is being drawn into the Shadow Realm, which kind of confirmed to me that they are indeed going for Morgoth's crown to have the same effect as the later Morgul blades. The big clue here is Gil-galad's use of the term Shadow Realm, which doesn't appear in Tolkien's writings. However, in the Fellowship of the Ring film, Aragorn uses the term Shadow World, another original phrase to describe the unseen world. Now, I've talked in previous breakdowns that the show seems very murky on what it means by the unseen world. At various times, it's been used as an ominous name of a place from which Sauron wants to harness a power over flesh, and Sauron later said that all beings in both the seen and unseen worlds would know of Celebrimbor's failure. In reality, the unseen world is basically just another facet of the seen world, where most everything we see occur takes place. The unseen is neither good or evil, and is just a place where magical beings simultaneously exist along with their seen forms. A being like Galadriel, who had previously lived in Valinor, already exists in both the seen and unseen realm. So her immortal being pulled into the unseen doesn't really make much sense here from a lore perspective. As I previously mentioned, Frodo received such a wound at Weathertop, and his putting on the One Ring was a preview of where he would have existed if Elrond had not healed him a couple weeks later. It's notable that a Morgul wound is not, historically, an immediate death sentence. In the appendices, we learn of a ruling steward named Boromir, whom the member of the Fellowship is named after, that was a strong and mighty warrior of Gondor. So much so, it is said the Witch King actually feared him. During his battles against the orcs, he received a Morgul wound, and while he would become shrunken with pain, he would rule Gondor for 12 years before dying at the age of 79. Now, returning to the show here, we can't say for certain Morgoth's crown is being treated exactly like a Morgul knife, though there are clearly similarities. Perhaps they're going with this being more concentrated or high-powered than a Morgul knife, explaining how fast it's working on Galadriel, who should be even better suited to resilience than a mere mortal. Admittedly, this does make me wonder if perhaps after enslaving the Nazgul, if the show might have Sauron break apart Morgoth's crown and forge it into the Morgul blades for his most fearsome servants. During his incantation of healing, Gil-galad makes a reference to the light of the Elder King. He's speaking here of Manwe, the king of the Valar, who is commonly known as the Elder King. Though in one of my personal favorite passages in all of Tolkien, Morgoth falsely claims the title to be his own in a battle of words and will with the mortal man, Hurin. Seriously guys, if you haven't read The Children of Hurin, do yourself a favor. It's awesome. Or get the audiobook and have Christopher Lee read it to you. It's also awesome. Back to the show, Gil-galad is losing against the darkness and Elrond picks up Nenya, and together he and Gil-galad are able to heal Galadriel. We then cut back to the hobbits, and Nori tosses a branch off her rock pile, and I'm pretty sure this is the very staff that the wizard picks up momentarily. Poppy starts talking, and we get a montage of events. First up, a shot of the dwarves grieving for their fallen king, and I just realized anyone tired of me complaining about simultaneous Durins won't have to worry about me bringing it up anymore because now there's only one. In all seriousness though, I do think Peter Mullen's performance as Durin III was pretty darn great across the board. It's definitely going to leave a big hole in the lineup. We then see a shot of Elrond turning away from Eregion as a tower falls. I'm not certain, but this might be the tower where Celebrimbor's forge was. Either way, it seems Eregion is indeed completely destroyed. We then see Isildur leaving on the Numenorian ship, and Estrid kind of tepidly taking the hand of her boyfriend that she was totally about to leave behind forever. Next, we get what I think is the most interesting shot of the montage, where Miriel is in shackles, albeit nice shackles that match her dress, as she stands before King Pharazôn. We see in the wide shot that Belzegar is reading off what is likely a list of charges. But what I think is interesting is what I think will come of this. It's pretty apparent right now that the faithful are pretty screwed in Armenilos, the capital city where just about everything has taken place. What I think may happen in Season 3 is Elendil leads the faithful to push back. Perhaps not so much as outright battle, but showing a level of force to combat the threat of the King's Men. And fair warning, some of my theorizing is based on book spoilers, but I wonder if, in an effort to avoid bloodshed, Miriel will agree to marry Pharazôn, and in turn Pharazôn gets legitimacy for his kingship. We don't know the circumstances in the books, but we know Miriel is forced into a marriage with her cousin. This could set up a Numenor closer to the books where the King's Men and faithful are coexisting, and while there are obvious tensions between them, they're not to the point of open hostility and killing. That is, until Sauron comes to Numenor and becomes chief advisor of the king. All told, it felt like we got a pretty small amount of Numenorian screen time this season, but I expect Season 3 will feature it heavily. This season felt like it went from introducing the rival groups to basically declaring war on the faithful, and it felt like we skipped over a lot of potential intrigue. I could go into a lot more detail on my thoughts here, but suffice it to say, I think we need a lot more Numenor drama and maneuvering before stuff truly hits the fan. Oh, and we also get the shot here of Elendil riding away from the city, the same vision he saw in the Palantir. No doubt he's on his way to the west of the island to meet up with his son and what is likely a sizable group of the faithful. We then get a shot of Sauron holding Feanor's hammer, and the theory that he will use this in the forging of the One Ring just got even more plausible. Personally, I think that would be pretty dope. I was hoping to see Celebrimbor using it for making his rings, but Sauron using it would have a bit of poeticism to it. And I know you all probably totally needed me to point this out, but you see, the Hobbits calling the wizard Grandalf is very similar to the name Gandalf, especially when the second Hobbit blurs the words together a bit for us. Then we get Nori and the wizard parting ways, and I was honestly kinda shocked they did this. I thought for sure Nori would be sticking with Gandalf for the foreseeable future. And apologies to any out there who might enjoy the Hobbits in the show, but by now you probably know that I don't particularly care for them. But my first thought when Nori disappeared to migrate with the Stores was, oh, that's a great chance for an exit. They could totally write them out of the show going forward with this conclusion of Nori and the stranger parting ways. Then they can give all that Hobbit screen time to Numenor in Season 3. I've gone on about Hobbits quite enough, but I'll quickly note Poppy's speech gave me a bit of that "there's some good in this world" speech vibes, and I don't think it lands nearly as well as Celebrimbor's speech about light in the previous episode. Anyway, moving on, we see the Grand Elf pick up a stick and discover it would make a perfect wizard staff. Something I could totally relate to from like the age of 5 up until, well, forever. Yeah, I don't think that's something I'm gonna grow out of. He walks off and we cut to Tom Bombadil back in his hut, and aside from having an amazing hedgehog teapot, we can see he already has 2 cups out, which is a nice little touch to show he's well aware the stranger is about to return. The wizard said he was meant to choose friendship over power and find his staff there, and I'm paraphrasing, but Tom basically says, "The staff chooses the wizard, Mr. Stranger." And then we get the final reveal of the wizard's name, Gandalf. Notable here is that he says that is what they are going to call me, which makes sense from a lore perspective as Gandalf is the name that the men of Arnor give him. Now Arnor is still a long way off, as that is the realm Elendil establishes in the north of Middle-earth after the fall of Numenor. Now, I know I've said it here on the channel for well over 2 years now, but I don't think it was the best decision to make this character Gandalf. Mind, I have nothing against the actor or his performance, especially in Season 1 when he had to work around barely speaking. I felt Daniel Wayman's work was really good, and he seems like a really solid wizard. My concern with Gandalf's inclusion is one of missed opportunity and comparison. Had he indeed been a blue wizard, it would have been a relatively blank slate for the show to make their own intriguing wizard character. Now that that ship has sailed, everything he does from now on will be measured up to what we know of Gandalf as a character. And if and when those don't align, there's bound to be frustration. Another huge external issue is that now we will have 2 Gandalfs in 2 different universes of adaptation, as we now know that Sir Ian McKellen is set to return for The Hunt for Gollum, as well as a second new Middle-earth film. Like I said, I think Wayman is a really good actor, but I can't imagine being compared to Ian McKellen while simultaneously playing the same character he made famous is a great situation for any actor to be in. Now, I could go on and on about this. We've talked about it on many a live stream, but I honestly think Gandalf was number 5 on the list of wizards this made sense to be from a story perspective. The 2 dueling wizards was an idea I thought had loads of potential, but even moving up Saruman's arrival date would have been much more inspired. He's a wizard we know also went to the east, something Gandalf says he himself does not do. And reframing a younger Saruman as a hero early on would have actually been great for the character, and accurate. Imagine seeing Saruman vanquishing evil and doing good, knowing that one day he will be corrupted. Anyway, I'm sure we'll chat more about this in future streams or in the comments. Now, all that being said, this small moment of Gandalf and Tom Bombadil sitting together singing in his house does bring a smile to my face. In the books, Gandalf seems to know Tom reasonably well, and before sailing into the West with Frodo, he actually spends 2 years just talking to Tom at his home in the Old Forest. And personally, I actually prefer this version of the song with the 2 actors singing the track. I kinda wish they had recorded the entire song. Speaking of music, we get bits of the rune theme as the camera pans down on the Dark Wizard. And honestly, I don't recall if I've mentioned it before, but I really enjoy this music Bear McCreary came up with for Rune. It's distinct, and the Bulgarian women's choir has a great sound to it. I personally kind of expected something a bit more Eastern inspired, but this theme is really cool. The Dark Wizard looks to the stars, possibly being able to interpret what has happened with Gandalf, and turns around and walks away. Now that we know who Gandalf is, the question turns to who this guy is. Again, I'm gonna hold out for Blue Wizard. The helmet guys doing his work had blue paint on their chest plates and on their horses, which I think may be a way the show is getting around the fact that the Blue Wizards are not so named in the books they have the rights to. What I really hope doesn't happen at this point is this guy turning out to be Saruman. That would simply make no sense as to why Gandalf would later be somewhat surprised by his turn to evil. Back in Khazad-dùm, Narvi tells Durin of Eregion's fall, and that his buddy Elrond is safe and led the survivors north. And I love that Durin's first response is to ask if his friend is okay. He says to send word offering aid to the elves, and Disa says the dwarves of the Blue Mountains paid vast tribute and want to get their rings in exchange. I think what the show is doing here is implying that the Firebeards and Broadbeams have remained in the Blue Mountains rather than joining Durin's folk in the Misty Mountains. We see they have here all 7 dwarf rings, which I was kind of surprised they recovered Durin's. I thought for sure that was lost in the Balrog incident. So 2 of these rings are likely meant to be sent to the Blue Mountains for the clans there. And here comes the issue with the tweak to the dwarven rings. Rather than simply amplifying dwarven riches and perhaps greed a bit, the ring making Durin III a raving lunatic has made it pretty impossible for them to distribute these. I'm guessing that's where Durin's brother will come in. I know he was passingly mentioned in Season 1, but the whole competing claims to the throne does feel a little bit out of left field here. It seems like they could be setting up a power struggle similar to what we saw with Pharazôn and Miriel in Numenor. Galadriel wakes up and Gil-galad says he's never known her to be such peaceable company, and I'll fully admit I chuckled out loud at this one, because as so many good playful jokes are, it's totally true. Elrond shows up and says they're in a sanctuary protected by the elven rings, and as we see in the wide shots, it's a valley, the Valley of Imladris, or commonly known as Rivendell. He talks about it being protected by the power of the elven rings, which totally checks out lore-wise. The realms of Rivendell and Lorien are indeed protected by their respective rings, wielded by Elrond and Galadriel later on. Now, I'm just saying, Elrond putting Galadriel's ring on her in this way doesn't do anything to help the argument of nothing between them romantically. I'm just calling it like I see it, but this looks like every wedding ring shot from every movie ever made. Anyway, Gil-galad says Sauron's armies are now going across Eriador, and all Middle-earth is in his reach now. Which, I'm glad he said this, not just because it's what happens in the books, but because I would not have guessed it based on Glug saying they were overwhelmed by the dwarves when they showed up at the battle. We can tell there's probably like 50 elves left in Rivendell here, but I really don't know how many orc forces are left. As I've said before, the show really struggles with scale at times, and all too often it feels like there's just enough people existing in a given realm or location that can fit on a soundstage. I think we really needed a shot of Sauron heading up an orc army if that's what the situation truly is. Gil-galad lays out the choice. Either they take the fight to Sauron or prepare their defenses. Elrond lays it out that the few survivors of Eregion are all but broken in body or spirit, and they kind of leave the decision to Galadriel, who recalls Celebrimbor's words about light being greater than strength. I would think their approach would have to be to set up defenses considering there's like 50 people here, about 10 of whom are soldiers, and I don't think little kids like this are going to do much damage against the orcs. But they really don't say what their decision is, I don't think. But Gil-galad does draw his sword, and the people seem pretty fired up about that. I kind of wonder how this scene might have played out if the elves might have been left to linger in their overwhelming defeat, rather than the few remaining getting hyped up at the last moment here. It definitely would have been a much different tone to end a season on, but it would have been an interesting move to leave it on a dark note, and then show Sauron and his orcs marching over the land causing destruction. Just a random idea, but let me know what you guys think in the comments. One other side note, Arondir, whose stab wound was apparently barely an inconvenience, is now with all the other elves, and I hope he gets more to do in Season 3 than he got in the back half of Season 2. He's just kind of there in these last couple episodes, and for a character who comes across as the most elven in demeanor, it's kind of a shame when he gets sidelined. Hopefully now that he's with the A-team of elves, he'll get to do more. Now, the shield concept that they put forth as one of their options would make a lot of sense in relation to what we know about the books. After the fall of Eregion, Sauron's great force of orcs overruns Eriador. Elrond is cornered in Rivendell, and Gil-galad and Círdan are left to hold out in Lindon. Oh yeah, we didn't get any more Círdan this season. That's a bummer, because I really liked him. We better get more of him in Season 3 because that was some spot-on casting. Anyway, the elves are basically up against it until the Numenorians arrive to aid them and bail them out, leading to Sauron's defeat. This leads Sauron to harbor a hatred of the Numenorians and go on to be the author of their downfall. As I've guessed before, I think they'll condense things and have Pharazôn come to the aid of the elves of Eriador for some reason, and take Sauron captive back to Numenor directly from that battle instead of centuries later. But we'll see how that plays out. Either way, I really hope and expect Numenor to be the primary focus of Season 3. I think their story needs the increased screen time, and the show needs that storyline to become the replacement focus and fill the hole left by the Celebrimbor Anatar story no longer being part of the show. I've got many more thoughts on both this episode and the season as a whole, but I'm gonna save those for my review of Season 2. As with Season 1, I'll do that after a full rewatch of the season. But I will say, just as an overall quick and dirty analysis, that while I clearly still have issues with some of the decisions of the show, and some very specific moments in particular, I think Season 2 overall is very clearly better than Season 1. Whereas Season 1 gave us nearly nothing canon-wise for me to care about as a book fan, Season 2 gave us some truly great moments between Celebrimbor and Anatar. The storyline I said months ago would be the most important of the season. The fact that Celebrimbor and Anatar were the MVP performances helps make theirs the best the show has to offer. Like I said, many more thoughts, both good and bad, on the way in my Season 2 review. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss that, and of course, our deep dives into Tolkien's Middle-earth lore each and every week here on Nerd of the Rings. While during our watch parties, I watch the new Rings of Power episodes on my computer, for my rewatches, I like to experience it on my Nerd Cave projector screen. And recently, my family and I have enjoyed watching our favorite streaming shows, while also enjoying some local favorite restaurants with Grubhub and Prime Video's Tune In and Takeout. As I mentioned earlier, Amazon Prime members get Grubhub Plus for free, so there's $0 delivery fees on eligible orders. And with us being in the thick of Rings of Power Season 2, which means a lot of time spent on writing these breakdown videos, it's pretty great for this sleep-deprived nerd to not have to worry about what to fix for dinner after a long night of the Lord of the Rings deep dives. Enjoy your own fellowship feast with Grubhub Plus.